Hey everyone, this is Andrew Ty and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be showing you 5 AAA games running on the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the 10-core CPU and the 16-core GPU running on the brand new M1 Pro chip. The specific MacBook that I'm using is the lowest end of the 16-inch M1 Pros with 16GB of RAM and 512GB of SSD storage. However, I wouldn't call this low end at all. It is definitely a workhorse of a computer and it is more than capable of playing many games. So today I'm going to be demonstrating 5 AAA games for you to look at, and all of the benchmarks that I'm doing today are going to be linked to in the Apple Gaming Wiki YouTube channel, so you can click through and then look at the actual individual settings that I've used as well. If you check out the link in the description, you'll see that I've made over 300 M1 Apple Silicon Mac gaming benchmark videos. I always post these regularly as soon as I've recorded them. Please check out this playlist, I'll leave a link to it in the description. So today I'm starting off with a non-macOS title. I'm running the Windows version of The Witcher 3. This is running through a compatibility layer called Crossover, which uses Wine to translate Windows API calls into macOS API calls, and the actual result is quite impressive. We are running here at 1080p at medium settings, and basically this is a huge improvement over the original M1 chip, where I benchmarked this about a year ago. However, there are still some stuttering issues generally, especially when new areas are being loaded. However, the overall experience of this game is substantially better than it was on the original M1 chip. In the open world sections, we're getting around 50 to 70 frames per second, and also in the interior sections, we're getting even higher. I'm sure that if I turn down the settings a little bit, we wouldn't lose that much visual fidelity, and we could crank up that frame rate up to over 100 frames per second, taking advantage of our beautiful 120Hz ProMotion screen. You can definitely tell that the GPU is getting a complete workout here. We are GPU capped at 100%, so when I test this game with the M1 Max, which has 32 GPU cores instead of the M1 Pro's 16 GPU cores, I'm sure we're going to get much better performance on that machine too. This game gets excellent performance even during outdoor combat scenes, which can be quite chaotic and can normally tank frame rates for other games, but I consider this very consistent and very impressive. If you'd like to find out how to get Windows games to run through the Crossover compatibility layer, please check out the link in the description. This is going to take you to my full in-depth tutorial on how to get Crossover working. Next up is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is a port by the company Feral to the Mac operating system, and this is using the Metal Graphics API. I've cranked these graphics up to the high preset and I'm running the benchmark for this game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is definitely one of the most impressive AAA titles that you can run on any M1 Mac. This actually ran quite well on the M1 MacBook Air, but it is cranked up to the nth degree when we run it on the M1 Pro. We're getting much better frame rates and much better detail, especially on medium settings at 1080p. The way this game handles detail, for example the shadows cast onto the ground, is extremely impressive, and this definitely makes it one of the best looking games that you can actually play on the Apple Silicon Macs. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we have a lot of complex outdoor environments with huge draw distances and views, so it's very impressive that we're able to hit 70 or 80 frames per second, even with all of this detail being rendered on screen at once. So this benchmark ran at the high preset at 1080p, and it was given an average frame rate of 54 frames per second. I also ran this benchmark again at medium settings, and it's also showing the same average frame rate. However, at medium settings, the number of frames rendered is slightly higher, so I'm sure that this is being bottlenecked. It'll be very interesting to see how this game performs on the M1 Max, which has double the amount of GPU cores. So next up is Overwatch, which is the competitive shooter from Blizzard. And this is a Windows only game that is running through a virtual machine on Parallels. So it's actually on the Windows 11 ARM operating system, which is emulating the x86 64-bit version of this game, and it's being virtualized on the M1 chip. So performance is going to be a bit hit or miss because there are so many levels of emulation and virtualization happening. However, you can see that it's fairly playable. I'm running this game at the low preset at 1080p, and it's actually impressive that we can play this game at all. I wouldn't really call this a competitive experience. It's something maybe you could use to join in with the game, and there's definitely a lot of work that could be done to make this better. I actually have a video of Overwatch running on the M1 MacBook Air, and this has had a bunch of Windows ARM operating system tweaks applied to it, and it's actually running smoother. So I'm sure that if I went through the trouble of applying those fixes and tweaks, then I would get an even better level of performance too. I mean, the main thing is that when you have a lot of enemies cluttered on screen, the game will stutter a little bit and drop some frames. However, once I have the time to update the tutorial for Windows 11 ARM, I'm sure I'll be able to get much more enjoyable performance out of this, especially for online competitive gaming. So next up is the game Metro Exodus, and this is one of the more recent AAA ports to the Mac operating system, and this actually ran great on the M1 MacBook Air as well, and it's running great here on the M1 Pro. I'm not sure whether my frame rate counter is a little bit broken or something, but it's stuck at 48 frames per second, but it does feel like it's running at 40 or 50 or even 60 frames per second. Feels quite solid in that regard. And this is probably the most impressive looking AAA first person shooter that you can play on macOS. And it runs beautifully here on the M1 Pro. This game makes a huge amount of use out of light and dark and also fire effects and other post-processing effects which add a lot of atmosphere to the game. Technically this game is an Intel game that has been optimized for the M1 but is not actually native ARM code. It's running through a translation layer called Rosetta 2, which does add some overhead, but it's still impressive performance nonetheless. It's definitely able to take advantage of the additional GPU cores, and overall it is a beautiful looking game. The Metro games that come before it in this series, Metro Last Light and Metro 2033, are also excellent macOS titles that are well worth playing if you haven't played any of those games in this series before. You can check out the links to those benchmark videos in my Apple Gaming Wiki playlist. And last in this list today is Baldur's Gate 3. And this is running on the lowest preset, so I can just test how high the frames can go. We're getting nearly 100 frames per second. However, what I'm going to do is to crank this to the ultra preset, and we're still able to maintain 45 to 60 frames per second, which is very impressive given that this game isn't even fully released yet. It's still an early access title that's being developed as we speak. What's even more impressive is that I'm currently running this game through Rosetta 2. This is the Intel version of the game. This is because I'm not able to get the frame rate counter from Steam to overlay over the ARM version of this game. However, the ARM version is very close in performance to the Rosetta 2 version. They are both heavily optimized and they work fantastically on the M1 Pro chip. What I love about Baldur's Gate 3 is that we have some really detailed character interaction. We have very detailed faces and hair, and the dialogue between characters is done in these close-ups, which is very well lip-synced and emoted. And the emotion really comes through with the amount of detail that's available in the facial animations and the textures, as well as the fantastic voice acting too. So Baldur's Gate 3 is a really good demonstration of what is possible with the Apple Silicon chip and the amazing integrated graphics cores. It is head and shoulders over what was capable in, say, the 2019 MacBook Pros, which I tried to play Baldur's Gate 3 on in the past, and it really demolishes that in terms of performance, as well as power efficiency and heat as well. Anyway, this comes to the end of my list today. It's just a very brief video for the moment. If you have a request for a game that you'd like me to benchmark, please leave a comment. If you haven't checked out my GTA 5 comparison between the M1 MacBook Air and the 14-inch M1 Pro and the 16-inch M1 Pro, then please check it out. I'll leave a link to it in the description. I'm also trying to figure out whether I should be spending more time benchmarking the M1 Max chip, or I should continue focusing on the M1 Pro and the two laptops that I have here in front of me. Let me know in the comments what you think. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.